Just as we said at the end of class on Tuesday, in today's lesson, we're going to pick back up where we left off using the podcast and the written transcript to fill in the gaps and complete our guided notes. During class on Tuesday, we completed key points number 1 and number 2. To quickly review that, the first key point, the takeaway that I want you to get out of this podcast and make sure that you know about the Black Death pandemic, is that the Black Death was a bacterial disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Here's the quote directly from the podcast transcript. The Black Death was an outbreak of what historians and doctors now call the bubonic plague, a zoonotic disease caused by bacteria transferred through the mouth parts of fleas. You also have this under vocabulary that zoonotic just means it's a disease that spreads from animals to humans. The second key point that we covered in Tuesday's lesson was that the Black Death was first found in the fleas of black rats. Then those fleas infected humans after the rats died from plague. Remember, the two scientists, Alexander Yersin and Shibata Buru, in 1894, traveled to Hong Kong when there was another outbreak of plague and noticed that there were all these rats that had died right in the same area that all these people in Hong Kong, in China, were also suffering from the plague. So they looked at the blood of the rats and the humans and found that each had this same bacteria, which they named for one of the scientists that discovered it, Alexander Yersin, Yersinia pestis. But they still didn't know yet how the bacteria travel from the rats to infect humans. In 1905, about 10 years after Alexander Yersin and Shibata Buru discover Yersinia pestis, another commission is put together because there's another outbreak of Black Death, this time in India in 1905, and they are trying to figure out how the bacteria travel from rats to humans. They found that it must be moving from rats to fleas and then to people. And you can see that in the diagram at the bottom of the screen as well. This is called disease transmission. This is how disease spreads from one living creature to the next. And in this case, the Black Death bacteria spreads from rats to fleas to humans. Now we're going to pick up where we left off, looking at key point number 3. The Black Death spread from Central Asia across Europe when black rats began stowing away with traders and militaries traveling along trade routes. Just as we did in class on Tuesday, you want to have open the podcast transcript. The text, you want to scroll down. So find the spot where it says, and remember, you can also do Control F and then type in here to find the spot. So once it's in your bloodstream, that's where we will begin. And then we will work on filling in the blanks to complete this statement.
Or blood, which of course injects the bacteria and starts the infection.
So once it's in your bloodstream, the bacillus reproduces extremely rapidly, making the immune system just go haywire. Typically, the body would attempt to neutralize and isolate the germ into the lymphatic system, but the bacillus overwhelms the system, causing blood poisoning, which then causes a rapid onset high fever. As the body tries to isolate the germ into the lymph nodes, the nodes swell and swell and swell, causing what are called buboes, or extremely swollen lymph nodes. And that's why it's called the bubonic plague.
See?
These buboes are usually on the groin, but can also be in the armpits or the neck, depending on where the flea bites you.
Right, so it's gonna swell closest to the bite site.
Mhm.
And typically, I think probably because they're fleas and they're not making it all the way up to your upper body,
Mhm.
they are really low. Those buboes are usually right in your groin.
Mhm. It's possible that if the lymphatic system is energetic enough, it can control the infection, but more often the germ overloads the system. As your body tries to fight the infection, you get a raging fever, become increasingly weak, and generally become dehydrated and delirious. Within a couple of days, the person dies of septicemia. Depending on your health at the time of infection and your age, etc., without really strong antibiotics, you would typically die in about 7 to 10 days. This variant, the bubonic plague, is not all that contagious because it's not passed from person to person. Instead, it's almost always spread through the flea.
A French friar wrote in 1360 that, quote, most who fell ill lasted little more than 2 or 3 days, but died suddenly as if in the midst of health. For someone who was healthy one day could be dead and buried the next. Lumps suddenly erupted in their armpits or groin, and their appearance was an infallible sign of death. Greek scholar Critobulus wrote that for those with plague in Constantinople, quote, the disease settles in the groin, a symptom that appears more or less clearly. To put it simply, the descriptions left by those who lived through it match up really well with symptoms that modern science attributes to Yersinia pestis. Just as a side note, for just make sure that you understand the language we're using, a pandemic is a series or group of epidemics. So like when we say that like the 1918 flu pandemic, that means that there was epidemics happening in multiple places at the same time. And sometimes over the course of many years.
Okay, so before we move on to the next section, let's take a look. So the key point, once again, is the Black Death spread from Central Asia across Europe when black rats began stowing away with traders and militaries traveling along trade routes. To get you thinking a little bit more deeply about the topic, how do we know the general location that Black Death came from? And why would rats want to stick close to humans instead of staying in the desert where they were found? The statement we are completing is as follows. The plague that hit Europe likely originated somewhere in blank or the southern blank region. It could have been spread by blank traveling through the region, bringing rats with them, or it could have been traveling blank. Let's return now to our transcript and follow along as we listen.
That's all. So anyway, now that we know what the plague is and how it spreads, we can finally start to explore the history of how bacteria-laden fleas cause those mass graves in places like Florence. The outbreak that historians now call the Black Death began its rampage across Europe in 1347. But as scientists have now proved, it existed for centuries before that, too. The plague existed naturally in wild rodents in particular regions, specifically in the American Southwest and in southern Russia.
It still exists in the American Southwest, by the way. So be careful hanging out with rodents in, the desert.
Yes, as one is likely to do.
Although we could treat you with strong antibiotics now. Though.
And UVR.
Yeah.
The plague that hit Europe likely originated somewhere in southern Russia, but some historians say it was probably actually Manchurian or Mongolian steppes in northeast China, while others say it was actually the Yunnan or Burma, was Myanmar, in southern China region. Other folks say it couldn't have originated in China at all, and actually probably came from Russia, wherever it originated. Unless it was disturbed, that wild rodent disease would just sort of hang out in those wild rodents and never travel. But something happened to transfer the flea from wild rodents to commensal black rats.
So in case you're not aware, the term commensal refers to rodents that live in conjunction with humans. So like the mice that live in your house, the rats that live in your barn, those are commensal rodents. Whereas like field mice or like what are the voles? Those are non-commensals because they don't live basically almost in a parasite-like relationship with humans. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They're called commensal.
Ew. It could have been armies traveling through the region, bringing rats with them, or it could have been traveling merchants. There just aren't written records from the era or area, so it's just really guesswork at this juncture.
Right.
The plague that hit Europe likely originated somewhere in Russia or the southern China region. It could have been spread by armies traveling through the region, bringing rats with them, or it could have been traveling merchants. They're going to talk about another theory of how the plague might have spread from Central Asia over into Europe. And they're going to talk about whether or not that theory actually makes sense. Make sure you have your transcript up in front of you, starting with one theory that does come down from the written record. I'm going to minimize mine so that you can see these images and the map on the screen. They're going to talk about this city called Kaffa, and that is right here where you see this orange and the date 1347. And if you can locate Kaffa, it will help you also to follow, as they mention, where the disease spread to next.
One theory that does come down from the written record, and it's a theory that you may have heard before, is that the plague was transmitted from the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe through biological warfare. Italian merchants recorded that Jonabeg, a warrior from the Kipchak Khanate, aka the Golden Horde, flung plague-infested corpses into the Crimean port city of Kaffa, and fleeing Genoese merchants accidentally then brought the disease back to the Italian peninsula with them. While it's definitely possible that this thing happened, Ulla Benedictau points out that the plague isn't really spread through contact with infected bodies. It's spread by the flea. And while the bodies might have had fleas on them, it's not likely that the number of fleas on those dead bodies could have had a big impact. But even more damning is that medieval people didn't know anything about bacteriology. So instead, they believed that the disease, or that disease in general, was spread by miasmas, or bad smells. This is going to be a major theme for the rest of the episode. So in order to believe that they were spreading the disease by using corpses and flinging them over the gates, they would have had to keep those dead bodies around until they got nice and decomposed and stinky, which seems like a great way to give yourself the plague, right? If you're like just keeping dead infected bodies just sitting around until they're nice and stinky, and then touching them and, you know, loading them onto catapults, like, it just seems really unlikely that they would think that this was a great plan. More likely, Benedictau says, it seems that the plague entered Kaffa with the commensal rats that accompanied the attacking horde. No need to fling bodies, right? Rats can just go wherever they want. And once the rats were in Kaffa, it seems like a no-brainer to believe that they also made their way onto Italian merchant ships loaded down with delicious grain.
The departing Italian ships from Kaffa sailed through the Bosporus and anchored in Constantinople, bringing the plague with them. A historian later described the Black Death's first effects on the city, quote, "So incurable was the evil that neither any regularity of life nor any bodily strength could resist it. Strong and weak bodies were similarly carried away, and those best cared for died in the same manner as the poor. Those who could resist for 2 or 3 days had very violent fever at first, and disease in such cases attacking the head. They suffered from speechlessness and insensibility to all happenings, and then appeared as if sunken in a deep sleep. Then, if from time to time they came to themselves, they wanted to speak, but the tongue was hard to move, and they uttered inarticulate sounds because the nerves around the back part of the head were dead, and they died suddenly." Ugh. From Constantinople, ships traveled through the Sea of Marmara and the Aegean Sea to the Mediterranean, bringing the plague to cities all around the sea so that Sicily and Alexandria were hit at the same time in 1347. In the winter of 1348, it arrived in northern Italy. One account says that Genoa blocked its ports to try to keep it at bay, but ships arrived further west on the coast in Marseille, which seems to have been enough to get the disease into mainland Europe. It soon hopped the Alps into Central Europe, where it moved quickly on trade ships zipping around Europe's rivers. According to historian Jean-Noël Biraben, the plague also moved rapidly on land routes, traveling, he estimated, 1 to 4 kilometers a day during 1348 to 49.
The disease likely hopped the channel from France to enter England, where it moved quickly around the small country. By 1350, the plague had reached even the most remote areas, including the Orkney and Faroe Islands. Even the Danish and Norse colonists living on Greenland were hit, leading them to abandon the island. Russia was spared for many years, but when the disease finally hit Moscow in 1353, it took a heavy toll, killing the Metropolitan Bishop Theognostus of Kiev, plus Grand Prince of Moscow Simeon Ivanovich, his 2 sons, and his brother Andrei. 1353 was the final year of this first wave of the Black Death, but it was far from over. Between 1353 and 1500, 18 major epidemics took place around Europe.